All right, there we go. Now I gotta try to redo this introduction that I totally nailed on take one. But we are live with the great, powerful one and only Steve Tripp, Top Strength Project, just outside of Providence, Rhode Island. And we recently ran a flashback episode with Steve. And anytime we have Steve on, we tend to always get DMs and emails from people that are just so absorbed, I think, by the energy and passion that you bring to the table for this. And so, we connected and said, let's run it back. And I think there's a lot of value to be had here because the last time we really chatted about your training was over 2 years ago. And so now we can, I think, dive in and reflect. And what we talked about off the air a little bit is saying, I think it's always interesting to see, what are the big rocks that have stayed present over those 2 years? What are things that were maybe eliminated because they weren't bringing a large enough return on investment to the table for you? And what are new things that have appeared over the course of that 2 year journey? And, I think that the other piece here that I'll have before we dive in and talk training stuff is just for people listening that don't know who Steve is, someone that I have a tremendous amount of respect for in our industry because I think he does an unbelievable job leading from the front as an athlete, as a coach, as a business owner. Just has so many good things going on. So always happy to have him on board. Steve, my friend, welcome.
Oh, thanks so much for having me back, man. I really appreciate the opportunity, and I love doing this stuff. I do Q&As on my Instagram platform sometime, and it's a lot of fun just interacting with people. And it also just kind of gives you feedback on what people want to know, what people are curious about. And it's also fun kind of filtering through the foolishness and kind of getting an opportunity to diffuse some of the BS that kind of plagues our industry as well. So this is a great platform to do it on. So I appreciate you having me back.
Absolutely, man. So let's do this. For people tuning in who potentially don't know who you are, can we give them just the quick rundown elevator pitch of who Steve Tripp is, what you do, all that fun jazz?
So as you said, I'm Steve Tripp. I'm the owner of the Top Strength Project. It's kind of a specialized training facility up here in New England. I'm in Providence, Rhode Island, just outside Providence, Rhode Island. I'd say we specialize in strength. Definitely a massive powerlifting and strongman community. For one, because there are only so many facilities in the area that offer that. And two, because I'm very fortunate to have all of the competitive equipment, all the barbells, all the strongman stuff, all the racks, calibrated plates. And when you get into niche clientele, especially powerlifting and strongman, where it's important to get your hands on those competition barbells, the competition plates, and of course the obscure implements of strongman that aren't available in commercial gyms. So us being really the only place in the immediate 30 to 50 mile, say 30-mile area, that there's a big draw for that. But we do a lot of work with General Pop. Make no mistake, General Pop definitely pays the bills. A lot of nutrition, lifestyle, et cetera, et cetera. But mostly the community is what drives what the Top Strength Project is. Having the best equipment is great, but it's a community-driven thing. And it's something that I'm very fortunate and grateful to have created over these last 6 years because I benefit from it myself. I'm a competitive powerlifter and strongman. I hold a few records, won a bunch of a bunch of state titles. Rhode Island 4 times, New York 3 times, hopefully 4 times after this weekend. A couple in Maine, 2 in Connecticut, I believe, et cetera, et cetera. I just hit an 850 deadlift in the RPS, which I didn't know was 5 pounds under the world record in the RPS. I wish I knew. I would have put another fucking 10 pounds on the bar. But just, just like you said, I love this shit. I live for it. I really, truly enjoy training. Something that you hear a lot when you post a video or you post a transformation or you post an accomplishment. People are like, oh yeah, hard work. It's like, dude, this ain't fucking hard. This is awesome. It'd be hard for me not to do this shit. So, I know what they're saying. I appreciate the sentiment, but it's not hard. It's enjoyable. And being a constant student of this hobby that we share, I think is really the key of continuing to grow and continuing to learn from people like you, other people in the industry that I'm fortunate enough to have at my place, and also learning a lot from my clients, members, coworkers, friends. It's just a constant it's just a constant means to just continue to build. You know, I feel like as soon as you think you know everything, it's when you stop learning. So I'm very fortunate to have my place and my gym, and I just, I live for this stuff.
Absolutely, man. So let's start the conversation here, because I think this is going to be a really important point for people to get. One of the things that's come up on the podcast a decent amount over the last, I think, probably about 8 weeks or so, like, because going into the new year, right, all these people are setting all these like goals and aspirations and new habits and all this other stuff. And, one of the things that we try to harp on a lot is, most of you are going to get really distracted by shiny object syndrome, and you're going to just like dance around a bunch of shit that probably doesn't matter that much. And at the end of the day, like, there are core big rocks that work, and they work every single time, and they may not be sexy, but if you consistently execute on these core big rocks, you will get stronger. You will put on muscle. You will see improvement on a week by week, month by month, quarter by quarter basis, right? So I would love to hear, if you think about, the evolution of your training over the last 2 years, what are, I think the core big rocks for you that just haven't really changed much, right? Like, they were working then, they're still working now, and we're still going to get after and attack those on a pretty consistent basis.
Well, I'm sure, I hope that just about everyone you ask that question to in this landscape, in this setting, will bring up just the compound lifts, the big bang for your buck lifts. The squat or variations of, which we'll get into in a bit, the deadlift or variations of, pressing, rowing, vertical pulling, and vertical and horizontal pressing. Those all have to be in there. And a common misconception is, oh, I'm old, I'm 60, I'm 70, I shouldn't be deadlifting. Yes, you absolutely fucking should. You should be squatting. There's ways to accommodate these movements, but loading your system is so important for everybody. So that'll never change. Nutrition obviously plays a huge role. I think we spoke last time briefly about, the pie wheel everyone wants to create, like, oh, it's 80% diet, 20% training, whatever. I couldn't disagree with that more. It's 100% training, 100% diet, 100% recovery. If you half-ass anything, you're just leaving some low-hanging fruit out on the table. And I'm not saying you have to be a zealot and execute everything, but don't think that any one thing is more important than the other, because it's not. Wherever you cut corners is where you're going to lose potential progress. And that's why it's so great sometimes to sit down with somebody and go over what you're doing, because they may notice some low-hanging fruit that you're leaving out that you could really benefit from. I think we all kind of get in our own head, and we like to continue to do things that we think we're good at, and avoid things that challenge us. But your challenge should create your direction, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I love that. And this is something that we harp on a lot, so I'm glad you said it, right? This focus on the big compound movements, because at the end of the day, that's where we're going to be able to generate the most force. That's where we're going to be able to move the most mass. That's where we're going to be able to get the largest recruitment. And the question isn't whether or not you should be doing them. The question is what variation is right for you. And that's where I think people miss the boat sometimes, right? Like, we have to find places in training for people where you can shut your brain off and you can just focus purely on output, right? Like, maybe for you, that's a hack squat. Like, maybe if we put you in a machine, that puts you in a more successful position. Maybe it's a safety bar squat. Maybe it's a high handle trap bar deadlift, whatever it is, right? Like, it's find the right thing for that person that allows them to focus on force and velocity and mass. And then we can worry about the other things in other places in the programming. But you've got to have that big block in training where it's a big movement and we're just here and we're showing up and we're putting out on it. But I think too many people miss that sometimes because they get a little bit too finesse with what they're doing. So yeah, it's got to be a staple.
Yeah, and you can communicate it as simple as, in everyone's structure, regardless whether you're a world-class athlete or a 65-year-old just got a prosthetic hip installed, you have to get some kind of lower body push, some kind of lower body pull, some kind of horizontal push and pull, and some kind of vertical push and pull. And there are many, many ways you can accommodate. So like you said, a hack squat or a leg press, that's a lower body push. Everybody thinks, oh, it's got to be a squat. It does. You can absolutely, and you should absolutely utilize the constraints of a machine for somebody if it's deemed appropriate, with the goal of eventually getting back out in the open and an open chain lift.
Yep.
But at the end of the day, all that stuff has to be in there because, we are a system. Everything works together in unison. So you can't just develop one of these functions and take it and not develop the other, because as you continue to create these gaps, the likelihood of injury just increases right along with that progress on one side and lack of progress on the other.
Mm-hmm. Without question. And so I think you had mentioned this when we were chatting a little bit here before we started recording, in terms of some things that you have adjusted and changed in your training over the last 2 years. I know you had mentioned, I think one that'd be interesting to get into is, and you started to talk about it here briefly, in terms of when we think about a squat or we think about a deadlift, obviously the first place everyone's minds go, because of the history of strength and conditioning, the history of our sport, we're thinking straight bar back squat, straight bar deadlift, the two king lifts. That's kind of what everything references back to. But you had mentioned that you've been starting to play around more with, not getting away from the straight bar, right? Like air quotes, like it's still there, but maybe you're spending more time accumulating training volume off of a straight bar.
Yeah,
correct me,
absolutely.
obviously, if I'm wrong there.
Well, for one, it's nice to offer your so for myself, offering a different stimulus to kind of resensitize yourself to the competition, low bar back squat, barbell deadlift, whatever it may be. That's going to be a staple in 8, 9, 10 months of my training. But taking a step back, particularly after a peak or after an injury or after a setback, offering yourself a different stimulus is going to, cover a couple gaps that may have been created while hammering the same pattern over and over again. But the point that I made earlier that you just referenced is basically, for the longest time, I was so married to the barbell back squat and the barbell deadlift for my clients. And I basically would, everybody has to get there, but that's such an ignorant and not thorough approach. You shouldn't be married to any one lift, especially when working with such a broad clientele. It's rather than, I would find myself queuing to try to get somebody to do, let's say, a barbell back squat, when it's like, I think kind of a nice way to govern yourself is if I have to throw half a dozen cues at this person, or really more than one or two, to get them to execute it correctly and feel it and feel like they've accomplished something, it's probably the wrong lift. It's probably the wrong variation of the lift, So usually I'll get them, so let's say from a barbell back squat, taking them to low bar to high bar. The next regression would probably be, you can incorporate heel elevation, but getting under an SSB, the Kabuki transformer bar is, it's a staple. It has to be in everyone's gym.
So wonderful. Gym. It's so amazing.
It's so great. And it's such a great piece, but just a classic SSB is great. Heel elevated goblet squat, searchers, basically tailoring the movement to the person so that I don't have to throw a million cues at them. These people should just be able to move. And also, I think when you're throwing so many cues at people, they get too much in their head and it gets away from the output like you talked about. And that's something that I've noticed over the last 3 to 5 or more years in this industry is people are getting further and further away from realizing that at the end of the day, the most important piece of all of this is output. It's output. And people learn these drills, people learn these variations. There's so much information readily available that they become so consumed with all this other minutia and all these other things, and they forget, like, at the end of the day, we're just trying to do the most work possible because that's what's going to cause the training adaptation. So being able to tailor movements to the individual so they can do that, create more effective optimal output is a huge piece of something that I continue to try and become better and better at. Fitting the movement to the individual rather than trying to fit the individual to a specific movement that, for whatever foolish reason, I had some bias towards. It's very important to get away from that.
I think that mental overload's a really important point because, just with social media and the internet and with, I think, how a lot of people in their own training approach things, right? Like, I'm going to say, you cannot be strong, fast, and powerful if your mental gears are sitting there trying to churn the whole time. If you're like, okay, I need this and I need this. If you're like trying to process 6 or 7 cues, you're just going to be super slow and clunky, right? Like any athlete in any endeavor, there's going to be a divide in your training. There'll be places where, yeah, we really get into the nitty gritty and focus on small details, and I want you thinking. But that output movement for us, the way we'd like to talk about it is that's game day. If you're sitting on game day, sitting there trying to think about 72 different things, you're going to get your ass run over. You're going to be slow.
Yeah.
Right. And so, like, have spots in your training where you can get detailed like that. We talk about splitting training into kind of two buckets, right? Like, if it's output, it's output. And if it's not output, then maybe I'm looking at something that's a little more sensory motor, if you want to call it that, where we are really going to focus more on cueing and feeling and like all these little details. It's no different than in baseball, taking a guy who's struggling at the plate, getting him into a cage to focus on tee work and really breaking everything down. But it's like when he goes back into a game to hit, if he's still thinking like he does in the cage on a tee, he's going to be awful.
Yeah.
So 100%.
Realizing that those modifications that you're making, the point is to get back to the game day mentality. Mm-hmm. That's the point. Don't become so consumed in that sensory motor, very conscious. I mean, of course you have to do that, but realize that that is a tool to get you back to being able to fucking go.
Yeah.
And I see it all too often, especially after an injury or after a certain setback. You know, they'll identify an asymmetry or compensatory strategy, and then all of a sudden these people become obsessed with getting everything perfect and all their ducks in a row before they can just execute. And it's finding kind of that balance, realizing what that's for, and what it's for is to get you back on the horse, you know?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and get away from that fragility mindset that I think far too many people are getting themselves into nowadays. You know, that's a whole nother topic that we can get to at another time. But to come back to this, if we want to focus more on the SSB bar, and then I know that you mentioned that you have been spending less time on a straight bar deadlift as well. Is it more RDLs? Is it more, are you getting on a trap bar? What implement are you using there to get more of that lower pull, lower hinge?
So for me personally, I haven't had any issues on the barbell. So I'm able to continue to deadlift on a bar. Okay. Not that I don't use a low handle trap bar and variations of the deadlift, using deficits, using wide grip. Really so much for the deadlift specifically for me, because I haven't had many setbacks. I've been fortunate that my deadlift has kind of moved right along, aside from a couple, back strains and things like that, which just kind of come with the territory. It's kind of unavoidable, especially when you're working with, resistance above triple body weight. But as far as how much I manipulate my deadlift, it depends on what I have coming up. So for example, this Saturday, I have a 15-inch deadlift. It's on Jeep tire, so it's a higher deadlift. The barbell deadlift from the floor is still my A set. It's still my main primary driver, and I do the 15-inch as an accessory. The reason why, though, is because the weight happens to be very comfortable for me at 650. If I was behind and I felt like I had to bring up that 15-inch a little bit more, I would prioritize that. But I can say for my clientele and people I work with, I used to be married to the barbell, and I would use the high handle, low handle trap bar or variations of to get people back to the barbell. But at the end of the day, if you're not competing in powerlifting and or strongman or whatever, there's really no need to deadlift on a barbell. I keep them on the trap bar. And when you cue in the trap bar, I try and get them to hinge and not squat their deadlift, because you have the availability to do so in the trap bar. I still try and coach the hinge. But a trap bar is fine for general pop or anybody, any bodybuilder or competitive athlete that isn't specifically preparing themselves for a barbell deadlift in a powerlifting setting or a strongman setting. So basically not being married to that lift for everybody, because it's something that I personally feel like I benefit from.
Yeah, 100% in agreement. I think probably if I had to throw just a very back of the napkin guess out there, I'm thinking we probably about 90% of our clientele probably are almost unanimously trap bar, just because none of them really have the goal of stepping on a platform to compete. They just generically want to be really strong and to feel good while they do so. And it's like that constant trade-off, right? And then every once in a while, they'll like cycle around to the point where like, hey, like let's get on a straight bar again and see what happens. Yeah. And it's interesting because we have one client in particular that just made that switch. They probably spent 8 to 10 months off of a straight bar, just like high handle trap bar deadlifting, tons of high quality volume accumulated. They go back to a straight bar, and like this first few weeks, we're just getting technique back dialed in, right? Because we haven't seen it in a while. But by week 4, we were already hitting PRs compared to previous straight bar deadlift totals. Like we were taking a previous like double or triple max on a straight bar. We also have to put in context, this is an intermediate strength athlete, right? We're not talking somebody with outrageously high numbers on a straight bar. We're talking people that probably are in that 400 pushing a 500 pound straight bar deadlift. We're looking at probably like a two and a half time body weight type situation. But I thought it was really interesting how quickly that straight bar came back. And I think it was just because like the work capacity, the general strength, the generalized power was there.
Strength is strength.
After a few weeks, it was like, oh, I just took my previous straight bar deadlift max for 5. And it like, and it wasn't a high end set. It was just, oh, okay, casual. This just happened. And it's just one of those deals where I think we have to just continue to stay open-minded with the implements and tools that we're using.
Yeah, I think people can become very consumed with the idea of specificity. We spoke about this definitely on the last podcast, specifically about the squat and how it's my approach that if you have this continuum of squats and on all the way on the hingiest end, you have the low bar back squat, the competition low bar back squat, and all the way on this end, you have the heel elevated goblet squat. And then if I were to go from my left to my right, it'd be heel elevated goblet squat to probably some kind of Zercher variation, then to front squat SSB, I think are kind of in the same, high bar back squat to low bar. And it's my perspective that all of these all improve that, right? And the same thing goes for the deadlift. So here you have the barbell deadlift at 8 inches, and over here you have probably like a kettlebell deadlift. Then you go to a high handle trap, mid handle trap, low handle trap. All of these are going to improve that. And people get very consumed with specificity, saying like, oh my God, if I need to improve my barbell deadlift, I need to barbell deadlift. Not really. You need to hinge. You need to hinge, and you can't get so focused in your head and be like, oh man, this is my first time touching a barbell in 2 years. Just reach down and grab that thing and pick it up, and the strength is going to be there. And if you've had an effective cycle using a different implement, you should have improved without a doubt. The specificity doesn't have to be as finite as people think. You know, strong is strong,
without question.
This guy that so New York is coming up on Saturday, and I'm in my off season. I feel so foolish saying that I have an off season, like I'm some kind of, competitive athlete. But, I have nationals. My big competitions are next summer, and I just kind of peaked a month ago. So I signed up for New York 9 just kind of for fun because the events are great, and Todd's a very close friend, and I love his events. So I kind of just decided to jump in. But a week and a half ago, this guy named Manny Freitas signed up, and he's about an inch taller than me. He's 330 pounds. He's a fucking animal.
Big boy.
So I was like, it's on now. This off season competition isn't so much off season anymore. So how exciting! But the reason why I'm even bringing this up is he is a tremendous overhead athlete. He's got great overhead strength. Does a lot of work with the log. He has a 400 log and a 400 axle. And if you've kind of been following along, the overhead events in strongman are kind of becoming a little more dynamic. You're not seeing a lot of log and a lot of, AMRAP log and AMRAP axle anymore. Traditionally, you're seeing a lot of other implements. Circus dumbbells become very popular, and sandbag and keg are really coming into the fray. Coming up at Nationals in June, the event is a sandbag to a keg back to a sandbag overhead press. That's brand new.
Ooh.
And Manny hasn't touched that shit in years. And he just ran through at competition weight, a circus dumbbell to keg to sandbag after not touching them at all for 2 years. And he ran through it like he'd been doing it for 5. But because he's been training overhead and the carryover is there. And he just put that post up and he said just that. He's like, guys, strong is strong. The specificity isn't as necessary as people want to think. My overhead's there and the implements are there. And then I chimed in and I said, dude, I couldn't agree more. And that's exactly the point we're trying to make now.
I don't think that you can create yourself a large enough generalized pool of strength, hypertrophy, power, and work capacity. This is what we talk to our people about a lot because that's generally our goal, right? We think about these attribute bars: strength, hypertrophy, power, endurance, and movement. And if we are doing a good job of just continuously improving and moving out all of these attribute bars, then peaking off of this unbelievably large foundation becomes much easier for you, right? Because you're just generally always ready. And then if you say, hey, I'm going to go do this event, as the example you just gave, it's like the foundation you're working off of is so enormous. It's pretty easy if you then just like transition and then get the specificity you need over just a few weeks in preparation for the meet that you're going to go into. Yeah. And like, that's the thing. You have to like keep building the base, like build that generalized base as large as you possibly can, because everything else becomes easier once that's in place.
And the tools to build that base are the compound lifts.
Yeah.
We spoke about this, I believe, in the last one as well, where I tend to favor, even when prepping for a strongman competition, I tend to lean more towards and favor still the barbell lifts, because I think that, or I know from my own personal experience, that developing capacity in those lifts will improve the implements of strongman. And I don't think the inverse is true. If I continue to improve my ability to squat and front squat, it's going to carry over and improve my yoke, my stone, my carries, given, grip. Mm-hmm. But the other isn't true. If I were to do a training cycle and put, farmers carry, yoke, and stone on the front end, and those are my priorities, and I'm trying to progress those, I don't think my squat and deadlift are going to improve. But if I prioritize my squat and my deadlift, my stone, when I go back to a stone, it's right there. Just to kind of give some context, 400 was a max, back in 2017. And I don't do stones often. I do them a month or two out of a show. And now I can take a 400 stone for a set of 5 or a set of 6 in a minute. I haven't been doing a lot of stone, but I have been doing a lot of squatting, a lot of deadlifting, et cetera, et cetera. It's important to get touches on these implements because they're so obscure and so different. But prioritizing the barbell lifts and the meat and potatoes, the biggest return on investment lifts is going to bring everything else up. That's a tide that raises all ships.
I like that. That's going to be the title for this episode: meat and potatoes training.
Yeah.
Got to write that down so I don't forget it. I like it. So because you were mentioning that the safety bar squat, I think, has made its way into your training potentially more than it has been historically. What was the reasoning for the shift? And then what are some outcomes, I guess, that you've noticed from using that particular implement more?
I'm glad you brought that up. So for one, discovering, I don't want to say that the proper optimal way to perform the SSB squat, but in the onset, when I first got my hands on an SSB bar, I saw it as a great way to correct someone who goes into spinal flexion, someone who isn't able to maintain neutral. Well, way back when, I was a very extension-based pattern squatter. A lot of low bar, a lot of deadlifting, having this extension-based strategy, ribs out, anterior pelvic tilt, compression of the spine, and I always dealt with kind of low back discomfort. But I'm like, whatever, man, my back's sore. I lift a lot of weight; it should be sore. After work, and eventually those chronic injuries became bad enough where it affected my ability to train. Knee pain got worse, back pain got worse. So I started learning more about a neutral position, basically, rather than being, getting under a barbell or reaching down for a deadlift and going into this extension-based strategy. I learned about getting my ribs down, getting more oblique involvement, more abdominal involvement, having a more neutral pelvis, which brings more hamstring, more glute, just basically bringing more muscles to the party rather than relying solely upon my back. Going back to the SSB, when I originally got the SSB, I would kind of hold it, and I would basically, the SSB would bring me forward, and I would have to fight to stay upright. So I'm like, that's kind of this kind of caveman archaic approach, like, hey, this thing's pulling me forward. It's harder to stay upright and extended. If I do the SSB, it'll improve my ability to stay upright, similar to like a good morning, a barbell good morning. A good morning on the SSB is a great variation. After digging a bit deeper, I learned about basically reaching into the handles from my serratus, not a push, not with my chest and shoulders, but reaching into those handles. And because the weight is out in front of you, I'll zoom out a little bit. because I assume you're going to post this video. Reaching from here, that brings my ribs down, and it also brings my pelvis neutral. So now I'm stacked. Now, before I descend into my squat, my start position is a more neutral. I have a more neutral strategy. So I have more obliques, more abs. And when I squat, I kind of have more of a squatty SSB squat, more vertical. And I feel a ton of pressure in my abdomen. So basically refining and developing capacity and competency in that stacked position, which is completely facilitated with the SSB. When I go back to a low bar squat or a high bar squat, it's more squatty. And I'm able to recruit more muscles. I'm not relying solely upon my posterior chain, primarily my erectors, and I'm using more abs, more obliques. I'm using my quads in a better synchronized fashion, and I'm also getting more hamstring and more glute. So after using the SSB in that manner, it carries over to the competition lifts much more. I hope that made sense.
Yeah, I'm in total agreement. We talk a lot on the podcast about why we love, an SSB, a transformer bar, I mean, even a spider bar. It's really anything that's allowing you to get your hands in front of your center of mass so you can get this little bit of a reach to essentially stack the deck in your favor, pun intended, because that is the goal here is, can I get my ribs down and my pelvis underneath me and get this really strong cylinder position? Because when I can get this really strong cylinder position, now I'm actually giving my arms and legs a better chance to work, right? And so the extension has its time and place. It's a powerful strategy, but it's something we don't want to have to rely on and use all the time, because when we extend to that spine, you start losing frontal transverse motion, blah, 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 all that other fancy terminology. But your rationale is 1,000% the same reason that we utilize those lifts all the time with our clients. And our question is usually, hey, for your main squat, if we can get you on one of these, this would be our top choice, unless you have a very specific outcome you want on a specific bar. Otherwise, get your hands in front of your body, give me a little reach to bring ribs and sternum back, right? We can get more side obs. I can give you more hamstring. We can have more of this vertical displacement of a pelvis squat. And it ends up just being a really great way for people to build high quality training volume. And it seems to come from our experience thus far, the data we have, it comes at far less cost. Like we can move more load and do more work without getting as banged up or without as much like hip, back, and knee issues cropping up. So in my mind, it comes back to something we mentioned at the very beginning of the podcast. It's like, okay, this allows us to do way more high quality work than this other thing. So I'm probably going to use this tool as much as I can, and then we can use this tool whenever we need it from a specificity standpoint.
Yeah, so kind of a way to offer some context on how do I work this into my program? Probably, 8 months out of the year, by day one, so I tend to follow kind of a higher frequency program where I'll squat twice a week, deadlift twice a week. So if we're looking at the squat, my day one will be an SSB squat, not as hingy as a low bar. And I don't really take it to failure. I kind of leave a couple reps in reserve when I'm doing the SSB because it's more of a patterning, positioning exercise. And I can press it up, I press it up, but I'm really trying to really hone in on that vertical, solid, not really grindy pattern. So that's kind of my day one. And then my day two squat, be it, day 4 or day 5 of the training week, is my competition low bar. So you kind of combine the two. So day one, you use the SSB to kind of go back to that kind of squatty, favorable, neutral pattern. And then that kind of progresses right alongside the competition lift, where when I go to the low bar, I have an easier time maintaining a neutral position when I walk it out. And when I squat, I do a better job of sitting into my knees and staying right over my center of mass. How much my bar path has improved the last 2 years under maximal loads during a low bar back squat is pretty dramatic. And the SSB has everything to do with that. A low bar back squat is never going to look or feel like an SSB. They should feel dramatically different, but that SSB is going to carry over tremendously to the low bar back squat for those reasons. And I think we can kind of say that the trap bar is kind of like the trap bar is to the barbell deadlift that the SSB could be to the squat. The reason why we say general pop, and the trap bar can be a more user friendly deadlift is because of the hands by the side, When you are behind a barbell, you tend to go into extension to get those hips and knees and legs behind that bar. When you have a neutral by your side grip on a trap bar, you're able to maintain a more neutral position and have a more favorable, less costly hinge deadlift than you are on a barbell. So being able to work both into your training or just do trap bar for a cycle before going back to the deadlift will have tremendous benefits because of the less cost, but also getting, manipulating your position a bit so that when you go back to the barbell deadlift, the deadlift looks different. You're a little more stacked, you're utilizing more tissues, you're not so extended. And that's going to, basically lift your ceiling. Great way to blast through plateaus.
Love it. I love that. So we've got probably about 15 minutes or so here to play with. And so I know that another thing we talked about briefly off air that I wanted to circle back to that we haven't hit yet is the role that rest and recovery has played in your training over the last 2 years, right? Because as load increases, as specificity increases, right? Because you just pulled 850. So, and at a body weight of,
I was probably 265.
Yeah, exactly. And so I would be intrigued to hear how the management of recovery and rest has evolved for you over time, just because every time that you are doing these things, like the withdrawal, if you will, from the bank account is going to be pretty significant.
Yeah, so it's a hard pill to swallow when you're someone like myself who's been training for 21 years. And it's like, how do I get stronger? How do I build more muscle? How do I put more weight on the bar? Well, you do more work, right? Not really, because the work that you're doing is becoming more costly to your system, to your central nervous system. So basically, fatigue is going to accumulate. You're going to beat yourself up. And when when it's time to perform, it's going to mask your performance. Your ability to actually express this new strength and this new capacity that you created isn't going to be there. So to offer a little bit of context, back in February of 2021, 2 weeks out from the competition, I pulled an 850 deadlift. And then I went to compete and it wasn't there. It would have been a national record. It was at the competition was at my gym. There was 250 people there. They were all there to see me pull this national record. And I got it off the floor and I couldn't finish. And I cried like a fucking baby. I was so embarrassed and I was so upset. And I was like, why? Why is this happening? And the answer is, I'm not the athlete I once was. I'm stronger. I think it's safe to say that I have exceeded my perhaps genetic potential. I don't think I'm someone that was really genetically supposed to be deadlifting 850 pounds and squatting 750, close to 800. That comes at a cost. And I recently competed again and I hit 850 in competition, and I honestly probably could have pulled it for a set of 3. Damn. What was different this time around? I gave myself more rest. My last heavy deadlift was 3 weeks before the competition, and I didn't really deadlift a whole lot after that. I think it's also important to consider the complexity of the deadlift. It's not that complex. You don't have to hammer it all that much. You reach down, you grab the bar, you pick it up. How much practice do you really need? Not as much as you do in a circus dumbbell or a squat. I'd say that's more of a complex lift, and I think it's also not as costly of a lift. So you can work those lifts a little harder, closer to the day than you can a deadlift. You don't need to. So basically, giving myself that extra week. I'll tell you, when it came time to deadlift in this last competition, I was pulling my warm-ups and I felt like I could have pulled fucking anything off the floor. And all it was just giving myself the requisite amount of rest to be able to perform on game day.
Yeah, I like that. There's a distinction here between, right, like readiness and preparedness. They're really like two different things. And so I think that realization is really important, because like you had the capacity to hit 850 even though you missed it, right? You just weren't putting yourself in a position to be able to express that yet because it was masked by some level of fatigue that had not come out of the system at that point.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What ended up happening was I probably could have hit it back in February, but the mistake I made was, so that was 2 weeks out, and a week out, I worked up to my openers, which is something I've always done, and it's something I have a lot of my clients do, and it's fine. But when it came to the deadlift, I didn't need to hit 800 a week out. When I did, it was slow. It took everything I had, and I was like, well, no big deal. I hit it. I'll recover in time, but I didn't. That took too much out of me. And like I said, this time around, I still worked up to my squat opener. I still worked up to my bench opener. I didn't work up quite to my squat opener, close to. But I hit like a 600 deadlift a week out. And it flew, and I called it there, and I listened to my body. I gave myself the requisite rest for that particular, movement. And then on the competition day, it was there. So basically, this concept doesn't apply to all lifts. You have to be able to differentiate between the high cost kind of low competency lift of the deadlift versus the kind of lower cost, higher competency of the bench and squat. And basically realize that there should be a different approach to the three different lifts, because they are different both for how much they beat you up and how complex they are.
Excellent. I love it. So let's see, we're at about 41 minutes here. So let's do this. If you could have the people that are listening to this episode walk away with one thing they can take from this episode, or maybe we haven't hit it yet, but if they can walk away with one thing that you would love to see them go and focus on, doing or implementing, etc., what would that one thing be for you?
I think to appropriate it with where we are, we have we're just coming out from the new year. So a lot of people are getting started on their, they have their resolutions and things to follow, and they have these goals in mind. I think goals are great. I think goals are important. I think they're necessary because they give you direction. But I can tell you that I've had a lot of goals, and I've accomplished a lot of those goals. And as soon as I hit those goals, it's kind of like, what's next? So I think it's important to be goal-oriented. It's important to have goals, but I think it's very important to be very present in the day-to-day process, forming habits and rituals on the daily, each moment, each set, each workout, rather than being so focused upon the end goal. For one, because when you get there, it's whatever. But two, if you're focused on the end goal, you kind of lose sight of the small, specific day-to-day moments and tasks that it takes to get there. So basically, just getting started and executing these small day-to-day tasks and realizing the reward and feedback you get from all those, and just continuing to put your head down and continuing to work on all those small little pieces. I also think people focus a bit too much on the minutia and these small things that don't matter. They're like, oh, I'm having a lot more cinnamon. And it's like, but they're not eating, enough protein. They're not resting. They're not
Meanwhile,
sleeping.
They're 500 to 800 kcals off of where they need to be to break even.
It's like, never forget about the big stuff, the meat and potatoes. And with so much information readily available out there, people get distracted when it really just comes back to the fundamentals, focusing on the simplest, most mundane, and it's not sexy, it's not exciting. I mean, to me it is. To me it is. The most exciting stuff are the big pieces of the pie. Focus upon the most important factors. Hitting your big compound lifts, getting your food in, getting your rest, making sure you're hydrated, all of the simple stuff. You have to truly nail all of those pieces before you even think about the special stuff, because that stuff really doesn't matter. It's the big pieces. It's the low-hanging fruit. It's the best return on investment things that you really should focus upon, rather than looking for the secret and all these little pieces that really don't have much impact on anybody. It's focusing on the most important things, and the day-to-day application of those practices is what's going to get you to reach those goals, and then to go to the next and the next and the next.
Excellent. I love that, man. I have nothing else to add. I am 1000% in agreement with everything that was just said. So let's do this. For people that want to find you, Steve, where's the best place for them to go to connect with you?
I'm pretty active on Instagram, at StrippCam, STRIPPCAM. I'm not, don't get the wrong idea. It's my name, Steve Tripp Camera. A lot of people are like strip cam. They kind of think I'm like in the porn industry or something, but I haven't changed it. I'm just going to go with it. So at strip cam is my IG handle. At the Top Strength Project is the gym. At the Top TOP Strength Project, that's the gym. We have a website, thetopstrengthproject.com, all of which are a great way to get a hold of me and to watch and kind of see what I'm doing. There's always events and seminars, things going on at the gym, so it's definitely worth keeping up with. I have Josh Bryant coming of Jailhouse Strong on the 29th. I'm really excited to have him there. I'm actually plan to start working with him. He's going to be coaching me after New York next week. Nick Camby, who's been taking the entire strongman industry by storm, but particularly the middleweight. He's just been so dominant. He's coming the week before to the gym, so that's worth kind of keeping an eye out for. But Strip Cam and the Top Strength Project are the best ways to get a hold of me.
Awesome. And we'll throw all of that in the show notes for people listening. Steve, man, thank you so much for doing this. Dude, this was fantastic.
Oh, thanks for having me.
All right, fans, have a fantastic rest of your week, family, and we'll talk next Monday. All right. Bye.
Thanks, guys.